The year was 1742. Deep within the vast, snow-laden wilderness of North America stood a magnificent estate known to the locals as the Winter Court. This grand palace was the domain of King Alistair, a sovereign shrouded in whispers across the entire continent. Legends claimed that Alistair was the very monarch who had laid the estate's foundation stones over 2 centuries prior. Yet, despite the relentless march of time, his face bore not a single wrinkle. The world revered and feared him as the Immortal King, a man who had somehow outmaneuvered death itself. But the hollow halls of the Winter Court harbored secrets far darker than a mere blessing of longevity. The true crucible of this tale began with Queen Beatrice, the king's 5th wife, a woman completely unaware of the grim fate that had befallen the 4 queens who preceded her. Beatrice was no ordinary consort. She was exceptionally perceptive, observant, and possessed a quiet brilliance that allowed her to hear the lies hidden within the palace's heavy silences. In the initial months of their marriage, life mirrored a flawless fairy tale. King Alistair possessed the radiant visage of a 25-year-old prince. His piercing blue eyes held a mesmerizing depth, and his voice carried a seductive charm capable of enchanting anyone. However, as the brutal winter tightened its grip on the estate, Beatrice began to notice a pattern, a subtle anomaly that would unhinge any ordinary mind. According to the royal archives, the king's birthday was celebrated annually, yet the ledger entries intentionally omitted his true birth year. Court gossips muttered that Alistair had walked the earth since the dawn of the 1700s, completely untouched by decay. More unsettling still was the realization that the king never slept. When the entire court was blanketed in profound slumber, Alistair would spend hours locked inside his private sanctuary, the royal study. The heavy oak door to this room was constantly secured by 2 massive iron padlocks, and entry was strictly forbidden to all servants and even to the Queen herself. One tempestuous night, as a roaring blizzard rattled the glass panes, an unusual melody echoed through the dim corridors. It was not a ghostly wail, but rather a chillingly beautiful, otherworldly chime, a spectral tune drifting through the freezing air. Checking her bedside, Beatrice found Alistair's side of the bed completely cold, untouched by sleep. Drawing her silk gown tightly around her, she crept into the shadows, following the haunting melody down the winding staircases. The path was cast in near absolute darkness, illuminated only by the dying embers of wall sconces that cast dancing shadows against the stone. Reaching the threshold of the hidden study, she noticed that one of the heavy padlocks hung open. The king, in his haste, had neglected to secure it. Holding her breath, Beatrice peered through a narrow crack in the door. The interior was devoid of typical royal luxury, cluttered instead with ancient, decaying manuscripts. In the absolute center of the room stood a towering mirror, its frame embedded with pulsating, translucent blue stones. King Alistair stood directly before it. Unbelievably, the mirror cast no reflection of the man standing in front of it. Instead, the glass revealed a dense, snow-covered forest, glowing with the same eerie blue light from which the enchanted chime originated. As Alistair pressed his palms against the glass, the visible exhaustion and dark hollows beneath his eyes instantly vanished. It was as though the mirror was actively siphoning vitality back into his flesh. Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs. She finally understood that her husband's eternal youth was no divine miracle, but the work of a profound, ancient sorcery. Determined to unravel the depth of this mystery, Beatrice spent the following weeks observing the king's every movement with predatory precision. It was during this period that Beatrice uncovered an alarming pattern. Every 20 years, the king would embark on a solitary royal journey with his eldest eligible son, who in this cycle was his youngest, Prince Edward, born to his third wife. By royal decree, the moment a prince crossed the threshold of manhood, the king would escort him into the Whispering Woods, a dense mystical forest bordering the estate where an old hunting lodge sat. Oddly, whenever Alistair returned from these expeditions, he appeared more vigorous and youthful than before, yet his son never returned with him. To the court, the king spun a calculated web of lies, claiming the princes had been sent abroad to the grand capitals of Europe to complete their education and master statecraft. But Beatrice's meticulous investigation of the old castle ledgers painted a far grimmer picture. For the past century, not a single prince who entered those woods had ever sent a letter back, nor had a single trace of them ever resurfaced. They simply vanished into the snow. The king was not murdering his children, but he was abandoning them in a forest from which there was no escape. But to what end? What did the abandonment of his own blood have to do with his eternal youth? The winter grew increasingly severe, and the date for the impending journey loomed near. Prince Edward was now 18, a naive, bright-eyed youth who placed absolute blind faith in his father. Beatrice watched with growing dread as Alistair smiled at the boy. It was a terrifying grimace, not of paternal pride, but of a collector eyeing a prized possession. Beatrice knew that if she failed to intervene, Prince Edward would suffer the exact same fate as his missing brothers. One afternoon, while the king was occupied with the High Council, Beatrice risked everything to return to the locked study, armed with a counterfeit key acquired from the palace's old locksmith archives. Her hands trembled, but her maternal instinct for the innocent princes gave her strength. The lock clicked, and she slipped inside the sepulchral quiet of the room. Approaching the massive mirror, she began examining the wood paneling beneath it. Her fingers pressed against a concealed catch, causing a hidden drawer to pop open. Inside lay a freezing, dust-laden journal belonging to King Alistair's first wife, Queen Eleanor, who had mysteriously vanished a century ago. With trembling hands, she opened the brittle pages. The elegant script within shattered her reality. Time is a river, and Alistair has diverted its flow. He has found the mystical source deep within the heart of the woods. Every 20 years, by abandoning his own blood to the depths of the forest, the woods siphon the youth and life force of the prince, transferring it entirely to the king. The prince does not perish, he merely becomes a permanent extension of the forest, a living vessel that can never return. If Alistair leaves Edward there, before Beatrice could read the final sentence, heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoed outside the corridor. the king was returning. Erasing all signs of her presence, she concealed the journal within her gown, clicked the drawer shut, and slipped through a secondary servant's exit just in time. Her chest heaved with terror. She now held the keys to the kingdom's darkest truth. The king was trading his children's lives for eternal youth, and Edward's execution date was only 2 days away. Possessing the truth made every remaining hour within the winter court feel like walking on burning coals for Beatrice. Whenever she looked at Alistair, she no longer saw a handsome monarch, but a centuries-old parasite hiding behind a youthful mask. Yet she knew that without absolute proof, accusing him openly would mean her swift demise. She chose instead to play a dangerous psychological game, attempting to breach his composure and force a slip of the tongue. One evening, as a roaring fire crackled in the great hearth and a blizzard howled against the stone walls, Alistair and Beatrice sat in absolute solitude. The king looked as flawless and unbothered as ever. Handing him a chalice of crimson wine, Beatrice adopted an air of fragile innocence and asked a seemingly casual question. What was the true secret behind his unchanging youth? She noted how the rest of the kingdom withered and aged, yet time seemed to actively avoid her husband's face. Alistair offered a smooth, well-rehearsed smile. Taking her hand into his, he looked deeply into her eyes, his voice dripping with calculated warmth. He claimed that his youth was no grand mystery, but a reflection of his boundless love for her. He claimed that as long as her beautiful face graced his sight, time simply possessed no power to age him. With poetic deflections, he pulled her into a warm embrace, assuming he had successfully pacified her curiosity. But he failed to realize that Beatrice had detected the brief flash of panic in his eyes. Beatrice, however, refused to relent. 2 days later, during a quiet dinner under the flicker of dying candelabras, she pressed harder, targeting his most closely guarded secret. With a completely stoic expression, she inquired about the 4 queens who had preceded her. Why was there no record, no correspondence, not even a single portrait or memento of them left within the palace walls? Where had they truly gone? The moment the question left her lips, Alistair's youthful visage fractured. An ancient predatory coldness washed over his features, and the room's temperature seemed to plummet instantly. He slammed his crystal chalice onto the mahogany table with such violence that it shattered into shards. When he spoke, his voice carried a hollow, centuries-old resonance that sent shivers down Beatrice's spine. Without uttering a single word of explanation, he fixed her with a terrifying silent warning that made it explicitly clear another word on the matter would seal her doom. Rising abruptly, the king turned and marched toward his study. Beatrice noticed that in his fury, his posture had subtly deteriorated. His back appeared slightly stooped, as if the sheer weight of his hidden years was temporarily crushing him. She had found his vulnerability, but time had run out. The 20-year cosmic cycle was complete, and the very next morning the king and Prince Edward were scheduled to depart for the woods. At dawn, the royal steeds stood assembled in the courtyard. Prince Edward, entirely oblivious to the horrific nature of the journey, was radiant with excitement, viewing the trip as a profound royal honor. King Alistair had fully restored his mask of majestic youth, placing a firm hand on his son's shoulder as they rode toward the dark canopy of the Whispering Woods. Watching from the highest tower, Beatrice knew what she had to do.
Dressing in coarse servant attire and concealing her face beneath a heavy black wool shawl, she slipped out through a forgotten postern gate, mounting a swift horse to pursue them in secret. The forest was unnerving. As she ventured deeper, the white snow gave way to an unnatural creeping blue mist. The gnarled branches overhead rattled against each other, sounding distinctively like hushed, mocking whispers. Maintaining a safe distance, Beatrice watched Alistair guide his son flawlessly through the treacherous terrain toward the absolute center of the forest, a place where sunlight had never touched the earth. Edward's pace had slowed significantly. The very atmosphere of the woods seemed to be actively draining his vitality, leaving him dazed and compliant. After hours of riding, they reached an absolute clearing where the ancient trees grew in a perfect, unnatural circle. At the epicenter of this clearing sat a primal stone well, radiating the exact same azure light Beatrice had witnessed inside the king's mirror. Reaching the perimeter, Alistair halted. Securing her horse well out of sight, Beatrice crawled through the deep snow, concealing herself behind a massive boulder. The air grew heavy, making it difficult to breathe as the magical resonance reached its peak. The well began to emit a low, mournful frequency, and Prince Edward, completely entranced, began shuffling toward the edge like a mindless marionette. A look of grotesque triumph settled over Alistair's face as he prepared to surrender his son to the forest in exchange for another score of youth. Beatrice knew she had only moments before the boy was lost forever. Within the clearing, the air felt utterly stagnant. From behind her stone sanctuary, Queen Beatrice watched the horrifying climax unfold. Prince Edward's eyes were entirely vacant, his life force visibly intertwining with the blue vapor rising from the abyss of the stone well. Raising his hands toward the canopy, Alistair began chanting in an ancient, forgotten dialect that sounded entirely alien to human ears. As the incantations filled the clearing, the liquid within the well began to boil violently, sending tendrils of blue energy to encircle the young prince.
Beatrice observed with horror that as the magic took hold of Edward, the strain on Alistair's face dissolved. His skin tightened, his posture straightened, and his shadow cast upon the snow grew denser and more vibrant. Eleanor's journal entries proved entirely accurate. The king was feeding the forest his own flesh and blood, and the forest was returning the favor by pouring the boy's youth into the father's veins. If Edward took one more step into that boiling mist, he would be transformed into another permanent, frozen monument of the woods. Banishing all fear, Beatrice acted on the journal's final revelation. The forest's magic could only be disrupted by a royal catalyst that was completely detached from the original blood pact. Though she was the crowned queen, she carried none of Alistair's cursed lineage. Drawing a concealed silver dagger from her robes, she drew the blade sharply across her palm, letting her pure crimson blood spill onto the pristine snow. Before Edward could breach the lip of the well, Beatrice broke from the shadows, sprinting directly toward the altar. Alistair whirled around, his eyes widening in pure terror as he realized what she intended. He lunged to intercept her, but he was a second too late. Beatrice slammed her blood-slicked palm directly into the boiling blue waters of the well. The moment the untainted royal blood collided with the ancient sorcery, a violent shockwave erupted through the whispering woods. The mournful chime turned into a deafening, agonizing shriek. The brilliant blue light instantly turned a violent, corrupted crimson, and a massive discharge of kinetic energy threw Prince Edward backward into the snow, rendering him unconscious but breaking the trance. Alistair let out a scream of absolute agony. The 200-year-old umbilical cord connecting his life force to the forest had been permanently severed. The mystical current reversed its flow. The forest was no longer granting him years, but violently clawing back the 2 centuries of time he had stolen. The king collapsed to his knees as a grotesque metamorphosis took hold of him. In a matter of seconds, his flawless, youthful skin turned to ash. His golden hair fell away in clumps. Deep, ancient wrinkles carved themselves into his face like dry riverbeds in a desert. The eyes, once bright and predatory, clouded over with cataracts, becoming dull and sightless. The man who had appeared 25 mere moments ago was instantly crushed by the weight of 200 winters. Alistair reached a trembling skeletal hand toward Beatrice, his voice reduced to a frail, raspy whisper. The grand majesty he once commanded had disintegrated into dust. Time, the entity he had cheated for generations, collected its debt all at once. With one final gasp, the old king collapsed onto the freezing earth, his brittle bones turning to dust beneath his heavy robes. The immortal king was no more. Breathing heavily, her body shivering from the unnatural cold, Beatrice rushed over to inspect the unconscious prince. With the architect of the curse dead, the oppressive red mist began to dissipate, allowing the first genuine rays of morning sunlight to pierce the canopy of the Whispering Woods in over 2 centuries. The ancient entity within the forest fell permanently silent. Beatrice managed to secure Edward onto her horse and made the long trek back to the Winter Court. When the High Council and the citizens witnessed the return of the living prince and learned of the true nature of Alistair's demise, an absolute silence fell over the realm. Beatrice presented Queen Eleanor's historical journal to the High Court, exposing the dark foundation upon which the kingdom's longevity had been built. Though shocked, the realm felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. The shadow of the child-eating monarch had finally been lifted. Upon regaining consciousness, Prince Edward swore his eternal allegiance to his stepmother, recognizing her as his true savior. While Edward was officially crowned as the new sovereign, the true administrative intellect and authority of the realm resided with Queen Beatrice. The woman who had arrived at the castle as a disposable 5th wife had become the undisputed savior and architect of the kingdom's future. As her first official act, Beatrice ordered the hidden study sealed with iron plates, and she personally cast the counterfeit keys into the deepest trench of the Northern Ocean, ensuring the mirror would never be found. The snow continued to fall gently over the stone spires of the Winter Court, but the corridors were no longer haunted by midnight melodies. Queen Beatrice had proven to the world that no matter how ancient or profound the sorcery, a brilliant mind and unflinching courage could shatter the most complex traps of time.